Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Telegram, Locals, and Twitter, and Facebook. And you can support me on Subscribestar, Buy Me a Coffee, and Locals. So today is episode 67 of the Casual Stream, and due to some in real life events I've been at, I was starting to think about how we come to know things, because how we come to know things was the topic of a recent event I was at one of the local churches that I've been scouting out. So I thought, well, let's think a bit more about this. Let's sort of take a deeper dive in how we can know things. Now, this isn't going to be discussing about what justifies a belief, right? Is it true or not? This is just going to be a discussion on how beliefs or thoughts or actions come to be. So the first thing I want to discuss here is the different ways that one can acquire knowledge of things. I'll divide them broadly into three categories: one which you call immediate, one which I call strongly mediated, and one which I call weakly mediated. An immediate source of knowledge is something that you have without exposure. You just have it. In philosophy, this is often called an innate idea, but also animals have immediate sources of knowledge, and it's not clear that they have ideas. So we'll get into that a little bit in more detail later, but just suffice it to say, the first one is you already have this knowledge. The second one is strongly mediated, which means the knowledge is acquired through someone or something else. So, for example, one might have a teacher or have the use of some sort of instrument or tool, like say a telescope or a microscope, to observe something very far away or large, or something very small. Those are mediated through someone or some tool. But and furthermore, they are also outwardly motivated. So there's someone or something outside of you that is being used or assisting you in this acquisition of knowledge. The other thing that I'd say is that there's weak mediation, which means it's directed by you. So, for example, through your five senses of sight, smell, hearing, touch, and taste. So, for example, if you hold a ball in your hand, you can feel that it's round, or you can look at a ball and see that it's round. Now, that knowledge still is mediated through your senses, but it's not mediated through some other tool or some other person. And on your own efforts, you can discover this without appeal to anything else. So that's what I call weak mediation. And the difference between strong and weak mediation primarily is the motive origin rather than something external to you, which is strong motivation. Weak or strong mediation is something external to you. Weak mediation is internal to you, and you have it within yourself to discover this. Now, the first, when it comes to knowing things, we can know things through instinct, through conditioned responses, through cogitation, through intuition, through experience, and through testimony. So we start with the first one, instinct. And this is where we get a kind of immediate knowledge that isn't even necessarily an aspect of thought. So instinct comes from the Latin word instinctus, which means to impel by pricking. So it's some force or drive or impulse is motivating you to act, not thought. Not thought. That's the key thing. Animals have this too. Instincts are things that we know without having to be taught. An infant doesn't need to be told to sleep or to want food or anything like that. The infant just knows. An animal, by extension, knows that as well. So in this regard, instincts are something that we share with animals. And man, being a rational animal, at least in part, as the ancient Greeks would have defined, we share this with the animals. But it's an important part of how we exist, because there are many things that we do, that we have to do to maintain our biological existence, that it would be tedious to have to constantly think about, rather than just responding to certain impulses. Now, of course, in the broader discussion of ethics and philosophy in the Western tradition, one can't give free scope to instinct or impulse, because then you get yourself in all sorts of trouble. Well, this isn't here to discuss philosophy or ethics, but merely the first part of how we come to know things. And I'll say that instincts are innate, immediate, and automatic. So by innate, I mean you just have it with you intrinsically. Immediate, that is without mediation. There's no mediation. It's just a part of who you are, your essence, your substance. And it's automatic, which means it's without thinking. The next one is conditioned responses. Conditioned responses are different than instincts in that they are learned, right? But they are like instincts in that when they are internalized, you act by some impulse, either some inner impulse within you or some external stimuli from the environment around you. So they are first a choice and then a necessity. You choose to do them and then you do them automatically. So for example, when you are in a high-risk environment, say like a firefighter or a police officer, these conditioned responses, right? If you take the time to think about them, that might be the difference between life and death for you or someone else. So the entire point is you don't want to think about them. You want to be so conditioned that you do them, right? So in that regard, it's like an instinct, but unlike an instinct, you're not born with it. And it's generally a choice that you make to then learn it. So it's both like and unlike instinct. And so what I will say is that in the first part, a conditioned response is learned. In that sense, it's inward directed. You have to choose to do it. And then through strong mediation, usually some sort of teacher. Some people can teach themselves by watching YouTube videos or reading technical manuals. That's true too, but there's still a book, a tool that they're using. And then it becomes immediate. It then becomes a part of your instinct, your not instinct, but it becomes a part of your substance and who you are, and you just default to it under the right conditions. So therefore it's automatic and you don't think about it. The next one is cogitation. Cogitation is the art of thinking. When one learns one's school lessons, you might not know the answers already or even in the field of study, but through a process of exposure, implantation, memorization, and doing. The student is exposed to the idea through a teacher. The teacher, if he is good at all at his profession, will be able to plant ideas as a farmer plants seeds in the heart of his students. These seeds will grow into a broader truth of knowledge that he's aiming for. Also, hopefully, you then plant within the student the inward desire to learn more. The student then must memorize the facts of the matter and form a basis for future studies. If you do not know the basic postulates of geometry, for example, you cannot advance to more complex problems. Lastly, doing, either by solving problems, writing papers, or the necessary physical activities, will build mental and muscle memory into the student who can perform them, performing the task without having to think about it. So, but in this case, the primary means of acquiring knowledge is by thinking and then reasoning out steps. Philosophy, geometry, abstract mathematics are really good examples of this. But even activities that, even training that has a physical focus often includes reading, right? There's manuals that firefighters and police officers have to read and master in order to be able to perform their duties. So in that regard as well, there is this effort of reading in a way that, say, mere training by example in like a gym or like a dojo to learn some martial art is not necessarily reading, though you might also read there as well. Think cogitation is learned, so again, it's a choice. You choose it. It's not innate. It's through strong mediation, through a tool, so a book, a YouTube video, a lecture, a teacher. It's performed and is an act of the will, right? So unlike a conditioned response or a instinct, it is not the result of some impulse. Primarily, it is the result of an act of the will, of thinking. Now we have intuition. And now that means to consider or think about something or look at something. Intuition is the direct apprehension of a principle. I mentioned this before in other videos. One might imagine two woodsmen, right? Both of whom have the same amount of experience in the woods, but one has a, quote, sixth sense of when there's danger. whether that be some sort of natural disaster like a landslide or an avalanche or a predatory animal or some dangerous human stalking you. There's no obvious direct evidence of any of these things at the moment, but he just has that intuition. And then it's always right, and he's followed it, and he's still alive. The other man who has the same amount of experience but lacks the intuition would be at a competitive disadvantage in this case. We often call intuition's sixth sense, and it's the ability to directly apprehend a thing without having, in that sense, it's immediate. It's a direct apprehension. Good examples of this would be also concepts in philosophy and mathematics, but it's not limited to that. Certain gifted people can directly apprehend something in the environment around them. Sometimes they can apprehend something inside of what's going on in a person by being able to read their body language or seeing sort of cues, right? All sorts of those things. And so intuition is innate, right? You either have these things or you don't. Well, I guess it's in part innate for something like, say, the sixth sense, the woodsman, or, the master captain. But it's also part learned as well. So when you're learning mathematics or philosophy, you then build a capacity to intuition. Now, even if it's innate, it's like a muscle, it has to be exercised, and so you still need to use it. It's immediate, right? It's internal to you. You have it as a part of who you are, especially if it's innate. But if it's learned, it might be the result of strong mediation or even weak mediation, but eventually becomes immediate. And then it's an act of the will. It's not an impulse. Though in some cases, an impulse might be at work, but not necessarily always. Experience is the knowledge one acquires by observation or by exposure. One can look at a thing and deduce from it certain truths and principles. For example, one can look at a ball and through experience determine that it is round, either by sight or by touch. One can, through experience of touching water or fire, learn that the one is wet and cold and the other is amorphous and hot. This kind of knowledge is also direct and immediate, like instinct, but unlike instinct, is learned. So experience is something that happens to you or that you do, right? So reading a book, you might learn something, but that's not experience because you're reading about someone else's experience, or someone else's intuition. And so by doing all of these things, you build this base of knowledge. But now experience is a useful source of knowledge, but in the modern age, it's been overprivileged because in one sense, it's physically impossible to have every kind of experience that there is. And so if we constantly hit the reset button on knowledge every generation, which modern technological society is trying to do, we lose ground because there's no way to have the experiences necessary to build this cumulative knowledge between people. And so, while on the one hand is sort of extremely potent, it's also very narrow. And it's hard to cast in a broad net. Now, one of the most effective ways of teaching is by having an environment in which everybody has to experience the same thing. And that creates a basis of commonality, a basis of agreement, which is why, for example, in the army, everybody goes through boot camp. Or why, if you read classical history, the polis of the Greeks of the Roman Republic, there were, well, more broadly, in any society, there were traditions and cultural norms that all people were expected to participate in order that they might have a shared experience from which to relate to each other, in which they can then use to build further their civilization. So, for example, if you have two people with radically different experiences, their ability to communicate is radically reduced, and their propensity for violence is proportionally increased. So in one sense, having similar experiences is very important for maintaining some sort of status quo. I would say that experience is learned, right? It's something that you do or is done to you. So it's both external and internal. It's weak mediation, so it's through the five senses. And it's not necessarily an act of the will or an impulse, right? You might choose to have an experience, in which case it's the act of the will, or it might be something that is done to you, either by circumstance that you find yourself in or someone else's will. So it can have a bunch of different directions in that, of origin in that sense. And then lastly, we have testimony. Testimony is to present a fact as evidence. Now, that doesn't mean the testimony is true, but it's presumed to be true. And, think of in a court case, the attempt is to prove it false. So, right, testimony can come from speech, a spoken word, or a text, a book, the internet. For example, in a text, or one would have to determine the veracity of the text, often by referring to other texts. This is often done in Christian apologetics. The Bible is tested against itself for internal consistency and against other historical and written sources. The same thing is done in a court of law, where the testimony of a witness is compared against other things the witness has said, or for internal consistency, or against the testimony of other witnesses. And through a give and take here, you can then determine the truth of the matter. Now, testimonies can then be weighed, right? Not all testimonies are considered equally true or probable or useful, and they can be tested in part and by using all the forms of knowledge we mentioned before, and then against each other. Now, we would say that testimony is something that is, in the case of personal testimony, it's innate. It's, you giving your thoughts on the situation. If it's something like a book or a speech or a YouTube video, then it's external, because you're getting that testimony from someone else. So it depends on the kind of testimony and the nature of it, whether it's internal or external. It's innate if it's coming from the speaker in a case of a court, but it could be strongly mediated if it comes from someone else or from a speech, lecture, or YouTube video. And it is an act of the will, not an impulse. So that's testimony. Now, all forms of knowledge, if properly internalized, will actually begin to look a lot like instinct, in the sense that it's immediate and becomes, it's not innate in the sense that you were born with it, but it becomes a part of your essence, your substance. So it's similar to innate, that it's indistinguishably a part of you, but it had to be learned rather than something you had at birth. So I don't know what you'd call that. It's sort of like innate, but you had to learn it. So in the life-giving sword, Yagu Minonori speaks of the learning the art of swordship being something that the apprentice first thinks about. He thinks about the exercises and the positions, but that is something that he should eventually stop thinking about. Because when he stops thinking about it, that means he has internalized it to the point. So it's a conditioned response, right? Back to my earlier version, it's a conditioned response. It's something that he no longer has to think about. And he argues that keeping thoughts in your head is like holding something in your hand. And so in order to hold new things in your hand, you then have to empty your hand. Now, you don't want to drop it and forget about it. You want to internalize it and make it a part of you. Now, this is something that is very similar. Well, actually, this predates, of course, Sherlock Holmes. But it's very similar to a Sherlock Holmes story, The Study in Scarlet, in which I will read the important element here. So this is Sherlock Holmes speaking to Watson about the mind. And this is very similar to what Minonori is talking about. Sherlock Holmes. You see, he explained, I consider that a man's brain is originally like a little empty attic, and you have to stock it with such furniture as you choose. A fool takes in all the lumber of every sort that he comes across, so that the knowledge which might be useful to him gets crowded out, or at best is jumbled up with a lot of other things, so he has difficulty in laying his hands upon it. Now, the skillful workman is very careful indeed as to what he takes into his brain attic. He will have nothing but the tools which may help him in doing his work. But of these he has a large assortment, and all in the most perfect order. It is a mistake to think that this little room has elastic walls and can descend to any extent. Depend upon it, there comes a time when for every addition of knowledge, you forget something that you knew before. It is of the highest importance, therefore, not to have useless facts elbowing out the useful ones. Now, Doyle is differing a little bit from Minori because he argues that the attic will eventually get full, and that these things aren't necessarily directly absorbed into you. Now, I don't know if Minori would say that all thoughts have to be absorbed into you, but there's a similar rhythm to this way of thinking about ideas. And it's one that we've often lost in being inundated by noise and the vomit of popular culture and just all sorts of competing ideologies and ideas, which just drown everything out. And then you have this jumbled up brain attic with nothing that sticks together, that nothing holds together. And it's just kind of a disordered mess, which is then reflected in society. Minori also talks about how an idea, when it is developed, thought, when it is developed in the mind, is like the moon casting its shadow on a pool of water, where the pool of water is the human body. As soon as the mind comes up with the idea, so as soon as the moon moves, the moon's reflection in the water moves at the same time. In such a fashion, he says, samurai ought to have his mind, the thought in his mind, move in such a way that his body moves immediately with it. Another example might be seeing one's reflection in a mirror. As you move, the reflection on the mirror moves simultaneously. And he argues that the body ought to move in the same way. All education is like this. All lessons learned are meant to get to the point where it is like the moon casting its reflection on the water and then moving immediately. So how do all these classifications help? Well, first of all, they sort of compartmentalize different modes of knowing, because people often get confused and sloppy when they say things about knowing, right? So one of the things that we saw in the heyday of the new atheist movement was this: they wanted to caricature faith as a bad epistemology, i.e., a means of knowing something that's false. Now, that's just sloppy, right? Faith isn't an epistemology. It's not the means of knowing something, right? Faith comes from the Latin fides, which means to have trust in or trustworthy. So when you say that you have faith in God, that's not the same as saying I believe in God, but rather I already believe in God, therefore I believe God will do what he says he will do. Now that's just sloppy and lazy and incompetent. But this kind of sloppy way of speaking about how we come to know things, which is more broadly called epistemology, and more broadly would include also how we know things to be true, which is not a part of tonight's discussion, we can then begin to see what these kinds of things are. So then, to go back to this new atheist conundrum, where does the Christian get the belief that God exists? Well, one is testimony, and that comes in two sources: nature, which the psalmist says testifies to the existence of God, and then also the Bible, right? And then also you could say, for those who are Christians, the presence of the Holy Spirit in them. Now, the last one wouldn't be testimony, it would be experience. And it would be an experience that one was exposed to because one chose to be a Christian, presumably because A, he was convinced by the testimony of nature and or the Bible, or was exposed to someone else who had the Holy Spirit and was convinced by that. But neither of those are what we would call faith, right? When you say you have faith in something, that means you believe it's reliable, not that you believe it exists. You already have to believe it exists to have faith in it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have faith in something that doesn't exist. So one way that this is useful is that it helps deal with some of these. Or also, too, people say, I feel when, or sorry, and they mean by that, I'm thinking something, when a feeling is not a thought. And it's a sloppy, confused way of discussing things, in part because they weren't educated to distinguish it. That's not to say that feelings cannot be a source of knowledge. They can. That can often be experience related or intuition or even an instinct. But that's not that's an impulse. That's not a thought. And so we can come to beliefs through either impulses or thoughts. And when they say I feel something, most people mean by that they're thinking, which is actually the opposite of what they're doing. That doesn't necessarily invalidate their feelings, but again, it's a sloppy way of describing it. And in fact, people who say that often don't do much thinking, which is the problem. They're partly overwhelmed by their experiences and their feelings, their impulses, and they don't really know how to suss that out. And so doing this helps suss that out. Also, in general, when you can perform or form some sort of ordered whole to understand something, in this case, epistemology, it's helpful in understanding it in general and communicating that knowledge to other people, because order is better than disorder, right? I mean, if you want to live in a house, you want it to be built along proper engineering principles in an orderly fashion rather than a slipshod, ramshackle shack. The same would go for a belief system. If it's organized and well structured, then it will last. One of the things we've seen over the last 20 years is modern ideology, modern philosophy is slipshod, ramshackle, and disorganized, which is why so much of it is falling apart. Certain ideologies had much higher cachet than they do now. For example, after 1991, communism took a nosedive. And then, of course, in more recent times, new atheism has taken a nosedive. In fact, Richard Dawkins has admitted that the new atheist movement failed and that they need Christian allies against the wokies. So, yeah, there's that. So, this is a little bit of a shorter episode today, but I think that this is a helpful, brief introduction to how we come to know things. We have in the chat, Big Brain Content, Manuin, Corbin. Hello. All right, everyone. It's Todd Lewis, the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.